My wife told me she was done with me at my father's kitchen table 40 minutes after the estate lawyer finished reading the will. She said it in front of my brother Miles, his wife Claudette, and two people I barely knew, Sandra Leffort and her husband Thomas, who Renee had specifically invited. I understood only later, because she'd already decided how the afternoon was going to end and she wanted witnesses for it. 5 days after that, I was sitting on a wooden floor in a hunting camp north of Sudbury, Ontario, reading a handwritten letter from my dead father that told me the 160 acres of Canadian shield rock and muskeg he'd left me, the property everyone in that kitchen had laughed at, contained cobalt and nickel deposits that an independent geological firm had valued, conservatively, at somewhere between $80 and $100 million. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the road to that floor in that camp went through 43 years of being the wrong son, and that part matters too. My name is Garrett Holloway. In March of 2025, I was 43 years old. I worked as a millwright at a pulp mill in Espanola, a small town about an hour west of Sudbury. I made $74,000 a year. I'd been at the mill for 16 years. I wasn't management. I wasn't on the path to management. I was the guy who kept the machines running so the guys in management could have a number to report to their bosses in Toronto. My older brother is Miles Holloway. 5 years older than me, corporate lawyer at a firm on Bay Street, drove a Porsche Cayenne, owned a house in Oakville that he'd bought in 2018 for just over $2 million, and that was now worth closer to $3 million. Miles had a way of entering a room that made everyone in it recalibrate. I noticed it at family dinners, at Christmas, at every event where we both showed up. Miles walked in and people turned. I walked in and people continued whatever they were doing. My father, Harold Holloway, was a civil engineer who retired at 61 and spent the next 20 years doing exactly what he wanted, which was fishing, reading history books, and taking long drives on secondary highways with no particular destination. He was a quiet man. Not cold, he'd hug you, he'd ask how you were doing, he remembered your birthday, but his attention had a direction, and that direction was Miles. Miles had followed Dad into something structural, something organized, something with clear hierarchical markers. I had become a millwright because I was good with machines and I liked fixing things, and a recruiter from the mill came to my high school in 1999 and made it sound like a decent life, which it turned out to be. But it wasn't Bay Street. It wasn't something my father could describe to his friends at the golf club without adding a quiet explanatory clause about what a millwright actually was. My mother, Jean, had died in 2019, breast cancer 14 months from diagnosis to funeral. She was the parent who called me on Tuesday afternoons for no reason, who asked about my work in a way that showed she'd been thinking about it since we last talked, who once told me, when I was 26 and feeling invisible at a family dinner where Miles had just made partner, that the most important machines in any building were the ones nobody noticed until they stopped working. I've turned that sentence over in my head more times than I can count. My father died on a Wednesday morning in January 2025. He was 72. He'd been shoveling snow off the front walk of his house in Barrie, went inside for coffee, sat down in his reading chair, and didn't get up. His neighbor found him that afternoon. He hadn't called anyone, hadn't left a note, hadn't shown any sign in the weeks before that anything was wrong. He just finished shoveling his walk and then he was gone, the same way he'd done most things, without much ceremony, without announcing himself, without giving anyone the chance to prepare. Miles called me. I drove to Barrie the same night. We sat in Dad's kitchen and didn't say much that was useful. Miles handled the arrangements. That was what Miles did. He handled things efficiently and without appearing to feel them, and I understood, watching him work the phone that night, that this was probably how he survived being good at his job. The estate reading was held on a Thursday afternoon in March 2025 at a law office in Barrie, a firm called Deschaines & Associates, which had handled my father's estate planning for 15 years. The lawyer's name was Richard Deschaines. He was in his mid-60s, careful, the kind of man who paused for a full second before speaking because he'd learned that pauses cost him less than mistakes. We were all there, Miles and Claudette, his wife, who wore a silk blouse to a will reading, which I'd always thought was a specific kind of announcement. Renee and I had driven up that morning from Espanola, 3.5 hours on Highway 17, mostly quiet. Renee had been quiet with me for several weeks. I'd attributed it to the grief of losing her father-in-law, who she'd liked well enough. I was wrong about what it was. Richard Deschaines opened his folder and read with the particular evenness of a man who has delivered both good and bad news in the same voice for 40 years. To Miles, my father left the family home in Barrie, the 2022 Honda Pilot. His RRSP and TFSA accounts combined value just over $400,000. His share portfolio through TD Direct Investing valued at approximately $230,000, and a cash bequest of $60,000 from the estate's liquid holdings. Miles didn't react. He already knew the shape of it. He'd been the one talking to Dad about estate planning for years. The specific numbers were confirmation, not news. Richard Deschaines continued. To me, my father left one thing: the hunting camp property located in the Sudbury district of northern Ontario, approximately 160 acres of land including a seasonal cabin structure. The legal description would be provided separately, and a cash bequest of $8,000 designated specifically, per the will's language, for travel expenses to reach the property. There was also a letter sealed, to be opened per the will's explicit instruction only upon Garrett's arrival at the camp. The room did something after that, not an obvious thing. Richard Deshane kept his voice level. Miles looked at the table. Claudette examined her fingernails, but there was a quality to the silence that I recognized. It was the silence of people trying to decide how to react to something that appeared on its face, unambiguous. Renee's hand, which had been resting on my arm, moved to her lap. Miles asked whether our father had left any explanation for the division of the estate. Richard Deshane said there was a note. He read it. My father had written, "Miles gets the visible things because he will use them visibly. Garrett gets what I kept for him. Don't interfere." Miles read that sentence twice. Then he said quietly that he wasn't sure what it meant. Richard Deshane said that was the language of the will, and that he wasn't in a position to interpret it beyond that. We drove back to the house, Dad's house, Miles's house now, and Renee didn't say anything until we were in the kitchen, where she made a cup of tea she didn't drink and stood at the counter looking out at the backyard. She said, "He left you a hunting camp." I said I knew. She said, "He left Miles everything and he left you a hunting camp." I said I understood what the document had said, yes. She said she wanted to have dinner that evening, at the house, with Miles and Claudette and Sandra and Thomas. Sandra was one of Renee's closest friends from the Espanola area, a woman I'd always found pleasant enough. I didn't understand why Renee wanted to invite them to my father's house the day of the estate reading. I should have understood. It would have been obvious to most people. It wasn't obvious to me because I'd spent our entire marriage trusting Renee's social instincts, and that trust had gradually obscured the question of whether those instincts were ever oriented in my direction. I said, "Fine, I'll stay another night." She called Sandra. I went out to the garage and looked at my father's tools for a while. The dinner started calmly. Miles had ordered food from a restaurant, lasagna and garlic bread, very Italian, very unlike my father's kitchen. There was wine. Claudette was diplomatic in the particular way of women who've learned to smooth things over without ever appearing to acknowledge that anything needed smoothing. Sandra and Thomas were cheerful. Thomas had a loud laugh. Everything was, for approximately 90 minutes, manageable. And then Miles mentioned the market. Not about me, not about the estate. He was talking about Bay Street, a deal he was working on, something involving a resource company and an acquisition. He was expansive about it, in the way he became expansive when talking about deals, which I think he knew was attractive to a certain kind of person. Claudette leaned forward. Sandra asked questions. Thomas laughed at something that wasn't quite a joke. I watched Renee's face during this. She was watching Miles with an expression I can only describe as calculation. Not admiration, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The same way you look at a flight departure board, checking whether you've missed something or whether there's still time to catch it. Miles said something about the estate. I don't remember the exact words. Something about the camp property, speculative. Whether I planned to sell it or whether it would just sit. He wasn't cruel about it. Miles was almost never cruel. He simply existed in a register where certain things, my job, my house, my general trajectory, didn't register as real options, only as contrast. Renee set down her fork. "Can I say something?" Nobody stopped her. She said she'd been sitting with something since the estate reading that afternoon and couldn't sit with it quietly anymore. She said she'd been with me for 11 years, married for 7, and she'd spent those years telling herself that our life in Espanola was a choice, that Garrett had chosen a trade because it suited him, that there was dignity in it which she believed. She said she'd told herself things were going to change, that I'd take a supervisory position or get my Red Seal certification upgrade or do something that moved us forward, that we'd leave Espanola eventually, that we'd be somewhere. She said she'd believed all of that, and what the will reading that afternoon had done was strip the belief away, because my own father had looked at his 2 sons and made a decision, and the decision was clear. One son got the life, the other son got a camp. I'm not going to build my future in a place where even your family doesn't think you're worth a real inheritance. The table was very quiet. She said she was sorry to say it in front of people. She said she wasn't going to apologize for saying it. She said she'd had 2 glasses of wine, and that if she waited until tomorrow she'd soften it, and she didn't want to soften it anymore because she'd been softening it for a decade. Then she looked at me. "Garrett, you are a good person, I mean that genuinely, but you have spent 43 years allowing the people around you to tell you what you're worth, and you have believed them every time. Your father just told you, in legal language in front of a lawyer, that you were worth a camp and $8,000. And you accepted it. You sat there and you accepted it and you didn't say anything, and that is exactly why I can't do this anymore. She got up, picked up her jacket and her keys, and told Sandra she'd call her tomorrow. She didn't look at me again before she left. Sandra and Thomas left within 10 minutes. Claudette found something to do in the kitchen. Miles stayed at the table. My brother looked at me the way older brothers sometimes look at younger brothers when something irreversible has just happened in front of them. Not superior, not satisfied, just present. Uncomfortably, helplessly present. Garrett. I know. He said she didn't mean it, or she did mean it, but she was drunk and scared, and people say things in that state. I said she'd been meaning it for a while. She just needed an occasion. He asked what I was going to do. I said I was going to drive north to the camp in the morning. He looked at me for a long moment. He started to say something about the property, something practical, about whether it made sense to go up there now, in March, when the roads would still be rough, and then he stopped himself. Something crossed his face that I'd rarely seen on Miles, something like restraint, like he was choosing not to offer the help he would naturally have offered, because the help he offered was always the same kind, and he was starting to understand it wasn't the kind I needed. Okay, be careful driving. I went to the spare room, which had been my room as a teenager when my parents lived in Barrie, and I packed my bag. I hadn't brought much. I added the sealed letter, which Richard Deschaines had given me in a plain envelope with my name written in my father's handwriting on the front, small, deliberate, the engineering print he'd used his whole life. I put the envelope in the inside pocket of my jacket. I slept for maybe 4 hours. I left before anyone else was awake. The drive from Barrie to the camp was about 3 hours, south on the 400, then north on the 69, past Sudbury on the 17, then secondary roads that got rougher the further north you went. I stopped at a Tim Hortons in Sudbury for coffee and a breakfast sandwich and sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes watching the trucks pull in and out. It was 7:30 in the morning. It was March. Everything was gray and brown, and the snow had that particular late winter look of something tired of being there. The camp was down a logging road about 12 kilometers off the highway. My father had owned it since before I was born. We'd come up here when I was a kid, he and Miles and I, sometimes with uncles, twice with friends of his from the engineering firm. We fished the lake. We played cards in the evening. My father was quieter here than anywhere else, in a way that had seemed content rather than absent. I hadn't been to the camp in 11 years. Renee didn't like camping, didn't like the bugs, didn't like being somewhere without cell service. I'd stopped coming because it was easier than explaining why I wanted to. I parked where the road ended and walked the last 300 meters through snow that was knee-deep in places and crusted over in others, so it held your weight for exactly one step before dropping you through. The camp was a single-room log structure, maybe 500 square feet, with a wood stove, 2 sets of bunk beds, a card table, a propane cook stove, and shelves of canned goods my father had stocked on his last visit the previous September. The key was under the same rock it had always been under. I got a fire going. That took 45 minutes because the wood was cold and the kindling was borderline, and I spent a long time crouched in front of the stove doing the same patient work I'd been doing with machinery for 16 years. Eventually the fire caught and I sat on the floor in front of it with my jacket on and waited for the room to become inhabitable. When I could feel my hands properly, I took the letter out of my jacket. It was 4 pages, my father's engineering print, neat and compact, dated November 2023, about 14 months before he died. Garrett. If you're reading this, you made the trip. I wasn't certain you would. You had every reason to look at what I left you and decide it wasn't worth the drive. The fact that you came tells me what I needed to know about whether I made the right call. I need to explain something before you read further, because what I'm about to tell you is going to seem improbable, and I want you to understand that every part of it is documented and verifiable. In the spring of 1989, I came to this camp with a geologist I'd met through the engineering firm. His name was Arthur Finch. He was one of the best field geologists in northern Ontario, the kind of man who looked at rock the way I looked at load-bearing calculations, with a certainty that came from understanding the underlying structure. Arthur had been doing survey work in the Sudbury Basin, which you'll know is one of the most significant mineral regions in Canada: nickel, copper, and increasingly cobalt. He'd been looking at properties adjacent to the basin's outer rim, where the major mines had already established their claims, but where there were secondary formations that the big companies had assessed in the 60s and 70s using methods that weren't as precise as what was available by the 1980s. Arthur looked at this property. He spent 2 days walking it. He took samples. He told me that what he was seeing suggested significant cobalt and nickel concentrations in the Shield Formation running through the northwest quarter of the 160 acres. He said the economics in 1989 didn't justify development. Extraction costs would exceed market value for those metals at the prices of that era. He said that could change. He said cobalt in particular was going to matter. He didn't know exactly when or why, but he'd been watching certain industrial trends and he thought the demand side was going to shift before the end of his career. He told me to hold the mineral rights, pay the annual fees, and wait. I paid $32,000 for this property in 1989, including the surface rights and the mineral rights. I have paid the annual mineral rights maintenance fees every year since. I did not tell Miles. I did not tell your mother until 2015 when I updated my estate planning. She was the only person who knew, and she agreed with me about what to do with it. In 2021, I commissioned a private geological assessment through a firm in Sudbury, North Rock Geological Services. Their report, which you will find in the lockbox under the floorboard beneath the north bunk bed, confirmed what Arthur had predicted. The cobalt concentrations in the Northwest Formation are significant. The nickel deposits are secondary but not minor. At 2021 commodity prices, North Rock valued the mineral rights at between $65 and $80 million, with a note that cobalt in particular had been experiencing sustained price increases driven by EV battery demand and that the upper end of their estimate could move substantially higher within a few years. The property is yours outright, the mineral rights are yours outright, no debt, no liens, no conditions. The lockbox contains the North Rock report, the original 1989 survey by Arthur Finch, the mineral rights registration documents, and contact information for 3 people: Arthur Finch, who is 81 years old and lives in Chelmsford, just outside Sudbury, a mining development consultant in Vancouver named Carol Whiteside, and a representative at a junior mining firm based in Saskatoon that Arthur believes is the most ethically managed operation he's seen in the last 2 decades. These are the people I would call in that order. Now I want to tell you why I left this to you and not to Miles. Miles is good at what he does. I made him what he is, or I helped, and I'm not ashamed of that. I saw a capability in him early and I pointed it in a direction. What I didn't do for a long time was look carefully enough at what I was doing to you in the process. I told you things that kept the peace in our family. I told you that you weren't management material. I told you that a trade was a good fit for you, which was true, but I said it in a way that was meant to settle the question rather than honor what you were actually good at. You are patient in a way Miles has never been. You understand how things are put together, not just how they perform. You read documentation, you verify. Miles would sell this property within 6 months of understanding what it contained. He would take the cash, invest it through the firm, and the mineral rights your grandfather's generation didn't know to file for, and I spent 35 years holding, would become a line item in someone else's extraction operation. You will do something different. I don't know exactly what. But I know you will read the North Rock report before you make a single call. I know you will talk to Arthur before you talk to anyone else. I know you will not be rushed by the numbers. The cobalt market is not going away. The world is building batteries. Canada has been slow to develop its own supply chain, and there is political will right now that did not exist 10 years ago to change that. What you're sitting on is not just a geological asset. It is a Canadian supply chain asset, and the right partner will understand that and pay accordingly. Take your time. The rock has been there for 1 billion years. It will wait. Don't tell Miles until you understand what you have and until you have the right partners and the right legal structures in place. Miles's instinct will be to help you. Miles's help will be to get you to liquidity as fast as possible. You don't need liquidity advice. You need time. I love you, Garrett. I was not good at saying that while I was alive. I'm sorry. I hope this camp, this letter, and what's underneath that floorboard are enough to say what I couldn't manage to say in person. Dad. I sat on that floor for a long time. The fire had settled into a steady burn. Outside, the light had shifted to that white winter afternoon quality you only get in northern Ontario in March, flat and clean and very cold. I didn't cry reading it. I read it twice, then a third time, slowly the way you reread a wiring diagram when the circuit isn't making sense and you need the diagram to settle into your understanding rather than just your memory. On the 4th reading, I noticed my face was wet and I'd been crying for a while without registering it. Not because of the money. Or not primarily because of the money, because my father, who had spent the better part of 4 decades treating me like a secondary consideration, had been watching me, had been cataloging the specific things I was actually good at, the patience, the documentation, the reading before acting, and had constructed, over 35 years, a decision around those things. He hadn't been ignoring me. He'd been building something and deciding who to give it to. He gave it to me. I moved the north bunk bed. The floorboard had a seam where my father had cut it with a circular saw. I got a flathead screwdriver from the toolbox under the kitchen shelf and pried it up. There was a metal lockbox. Inside, sealed in a Ziploc freezer bag, was the North Rock report, 53 pages with photographs of core samples, chemical analysis tables, concentration percentages for cobalt, nickel, and 3 associated minerals I'd need Arthur to explain to me. There was the original 1989 Finch survey handwritten with the Northwest Formation outlined in pencil on a property map. There was the mineral rights registration filed with the Ontario Ministry of Mines, updated as recently as January 2024. My father had been maintaining this quietly 1 month before he died, and there was an index card in my father's printing with 3 names, phone numbers, and addresses. I sat with the North Rock report for the rest of the afternoon. I am not a geologist, but I'm a man who reads technical documentation for a living, and I understand how to parse a report that is trying to tell you the truth about a physical system. The report was clear. The Northwest Formation contained cobalt concentrations that placed it in the top tier of undeveloped deposits in the Shield. The report's authors noted that their 2021 valuation was conservative and that commodity price movements over the following 2 to 3 years would likely push the upper estimate significantly higher. I slept in my father's bunk bed that night. In the morning, I drove back down the logging road to the highway, found cell service, and called the number on the index card for Arthur Finch. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Finch, my name is Garrett Holloway. Harold Holloway was my father. I've been expecting your call. How was the camp?" I asked how he knew I'd been to the camp. He said my father had called him in October and told him the letter was ready, that if Arthur heard from me it meant I'd made the trip, that if I'd made the trip I was ready. I asked what he meant by ready. Ready to hear the whole thing. I drove to Chelmsford the next morning. Arthur Finch was 81, tall, still moved like a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He made coffee and we sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. He confirmed every detail in the North Rock report and added context the report didn't have: the geological history of the formation, the way it related to the Sudbury igneous complex, and why the major mining companies had passed over this particular section of the outer rim in their surveys. He pulled out maps he'd made in 1989, hand-annotated, and walked me through the formation the way a teacher walks a student through a problem they already know the answer to. Then he said, "Your father's 2021 numbers are out of date, Garrett. The cobalt price has moved considerably since then. There's also a policy dimension now that didn't exist in 2021. The federal government has been actively seeking Canadian sources for battery-grade cobalt since 2022. Your property isn't just worth more at today's spot price. It's worth more because it exists on Canadian soil, and the right development partner understands what that means to a supply chain conversation." I asked him what he thought the current value was. He looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Conservatively, 85 to 100 million Canadian, depending on the partner and the deal structure. With the right partnership, one oriented toward long-term development rather than quick extraction, you might see considerably more over the life of the project. I drove back to Espanola that afternoon. I'd been gone 5 days. The house was quiet. Renee had taken most of her things. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter that was 2 sentences long and professional in its brevity, the way you write to someone when you've already said the real thing and don't want to revisit it. I read it once and put it in the recycling. I called into the mill the next morning and asked for personal leave. My supervisor, a man named Don who'd worked there longer than I had, didn't ask questions. He said, "Take what you need, we'll figure out coverage." I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I'd spent 16 years doing at the mill, reading documentation, making lists, understanding the system before touching anything. I read the North Rock report 4 more times. I read publicly available material about cobalt mining in Canada, about the federal critical minerals strategy, about comparable junior mining development projects in Ontario. I called Carol Whiteside in Vancouver, the consultant my father had listed. She knew the file. My father had briefed her in 2022 and asked her to be available if I came calling. "Your father was an unusual client," she said. "Most people with an asset like this can't resist hinting at it. He never told a soul." She connected me with 2 junior mining firms she trusted. I spoke to both over video call. The Saskatoon firm my father had mentioned directly was the second call, and within 20 minutes I understood why he'd flagged them. They asked better questions. They were interested in development timelines that matched the geology rather than the quarterly report cycle. They understood what it meant to be a Canadian domestic supply asset in 2025. 6 months after I'd sat on that floor reading my father's letter, I signed a development partnership agreement. The Saskatoon firm committed $12 million in initial capital for environmental assessment, permitting, and preliminary development work. The Ontario Ministry of Mines fast-tracked the review given the federal critical minerals designation. In the partnership agreement, the property was valued at $94 million Canadian, with projected development revenues over a 10-year horizon substantially higher than that. I didn't tell Miles. I did not tell anyone in Espanola. I kept working at the mill through the summer. I told Don I'd decided to stay after all. He seemed relieved. Nobody asked why I was reading more than usual on my lunch breaks, or why I'd started making weekly drives to Sudbury for meetings I described vaguely as property stuff. Nobody looked that closely. People who have always understood you to be a certain kind of person tend not to recalibrate unless you make them. Renee and I filed for divorce in September. She was straightforward about it. She'd retained a lawyer. The division of our assets, the house in Espanola, the truck, the RRSPs, was clean and relatively quick. The camp property was in my name, not part of our marital assets. I didn't volunteer information about the partnership agreement. She didn't ask about the camp. She'd never thought about the camp. Miles called me in October. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He asked about the divorce proceedings, and I told him it was being handled. He said if I needed money, if the lawyer fees or the settlement created any cash flow problems, he wanted me to know the offer was there, that he had liquidity and family was family. I thanked him. I meant it. Miles is not a villain. He is my brother, and he has always been the kind of person who offers help in the only register he has, which is financial. He doesn't know that the gift he's offering me is one I could now offer him 10 times over. He doesn't know because I haven't told him. My father told me not to tell him until I had the right structures in place, and my father was correct. Miles's version of help would be to get me to the most efficient exit, and efficient exit is not the point. Christmas 2025. Miles hosted at the Oakville house. I drove down from Espanola on the 24th. It's a 5-hour drive. I brought a bottle of Niagara Peninsula Cab Franc that I'd bought at a winery on the way through because it seemed like the kind of thing you bring to a house in Oakville. Claudette had redecorated the living room. Miles's kids, a boy 11 and a girl 8, were energized in the way children are at Christmas when they understand that something is about to happen but aren't sure exactly what. Dinner was good. Miles had ordered from a catering company. There was burgundy and sparkling lights, and Claudette had done something tasteful with pine cones. After dinner, Miles and I sat in his study with glasses of scotch. He'd bought a chair in there that cost more than my first car. He asked about the camp. Specifically, he said he'd been thinking about it and wanted to revisit whether I wanted to sell. He said he knew a guy, there was always a guy with Miles, who did rural property transactions in northern Ontario, and he thought a recreational property that size could move for maybe $400,000 or $500,000 if I priced it right. He said he could connect me, no obligation, just an option. You're going through a lot right now, the divorce, the mill, everything. A cash injection might simplify things. I looked at my brother. He was trying to help me. He genuinely was. He'd been trying to help me in this particular way my entire life, and he had never once understood that the help I needed was something other than a shortcut to his version of the outcome. I said I appreciated it. I said the camp was something I was holding on to for now. What are you doing with it? Fishing. I said I was working on something. What kind of something? I said a development project, that it was early and I wasn't ready to get into details, but I had good people involved and the timeline was solid. He looked at me for a moment. Miles is not a man who gets confused often, but for a second he looked like he was trying to locate me in a map of the world he thought he had memorized. In Sudbury District, what are you developing, a hunting lodge? Not exactly, but I'll tell you more when there's more to tell. He said okay. He raised his glass to Dad. I raised mine to Dad. We didn't say much after that, but the silence was different than the silences we'd had before. Miles looked at me 2 or 3 times across the study in a way that was, I don't know, recalibrating, very slightly, for the first time in his life, possibly wondering whether he had the map right. It is April 2026 now. I am 44 years old. I live in the same house in Espanola that I lived in before Renee left. I drive the same truck. I wear the same Carhartt jacket I've worn for 6 years. The partnership agreement is confidential. The development capital is being spent on permitting, environmental assessment, and site preparation, not on a new life, not yet, not until the thing is built. The permitting process is on schedule. The environmental assessment, a requirement under the Mining Act, will be completed this fall. If everything proceeds as planned, extraction begins in the second half of 2027. The first distributions from my holding company to my personal accounts will begin sometime in 2028. Arthur Finch calls me every few weeks. He asks how the process is going and tells me things about geology that I don't need to know but find myself wanting to understand. Last month he told me something my father had apparently said to him in 2022, the last time they'd spoken about the camp. Arthur said my father told him he'd been watching both his sons their whole lives. He'd seen what each of them was built for. He said the tragedy of raising 2 sons with very different capabilities was that the world had a vocabulary for one kind and not for the other, and that he'd made the mistake of speaking the world's vocabulary instead of his own for too long. Your dad wasn't a demonstrative man, Arthur said, but he told me he thought you were the more careful engineer. He just never found the right moment to say it to your face. I drove up to the camp last weekend for the spring inspection. The ice on the lake was almost out. The northwest quarter of the property, the formation Arthur had mapped in 1989, looked exactly like it always looks, Canadian Shield, dark gray and patient, entirely indifferent to what's happening on the surface. I built a fire in the wood stove and read my father's letter again. I've read it a lot of times now. The handwriting hasn't changed, the numbers keep growing. The man who wrote it is still gone, and I've made a certain peace with the fact that I can't ask him the questions I'd like to ask him. What I can tell you is this. My wife stood up at a table and told me I'd spent 43 years letting people tell me what I was worth, and that she was done waiting for me to disagree. She wasn't wrong about the pattern, she was wrong about what it meant. My father sat on a secret for 35 years because he knew which of his sons would open the letter, drive to the camp, read the North Rock report 3 times before making a call, and then do the patient, methodical work of building something instead of cashing out. He didn't build the asset for me. He identified me as the person who would build it correctly. Renee is living in Sudbury now with someone she met through work. She posted photos in the fall that looked happy. I don't wish her anything other than that. Miles doesn't know. He will, eventually. The development activity will become visible when extraction starts, machinery, access roads, industry chatter. Miles runs in circles where people talk about Northern Ontario mineral development. He'll hear something. When he does, I'll be ready to have the conversation. But I'm not in a hurry. My father said the rock has been there for 1 billion years. He said it would wait. I've been a millwright for 20 years. I understand how to wait for a system to be ready before you turn it on. The last thing my father wrote at the bottom of the 4th page below his signature was this: the machines that nobody notices are the ones that keep everything else running. Your grandfather's words, second-hand. They always seemed right to me. I didn't ask him why he'd never said so out loud. The answer to that is in the letter, and the letter is all I've got, and it turns out to be enough.